So after the first Easter Sunday, when the tomb was empty, remember? Well, I mean, you weren't there, but we read about it, right? We know the story. I guess you could say we are here because of the first Easter, yes? Because the tomb was empty, because Jesus is risen. That's why we do this. And the Bible tells us that Jesus appeared to his disciples multiple times, and I have a theory, because it didn't work at first. Here's what I mean. The disciples didn't believe it was actually happening. Imagine being Jesus. You rise from the dead. And if you're Jesus, you're thinking, surely this is enough, right? Surely at this point they're going to believe, but no. And you know why? Because the disciples were like me, maybe like you too. They were like, really? Did that really just happen? We're in this room, he appears, and then he's gone. He shows us, did this really happen? This is like a theme after the resurrection, where Jesus appears, says, hey guys, remember Babe Ruth, he calls the home run, boom, Jesus predicts his resurrection and then pulls it off and then shows up, and the disciples still can't comprehend. And I love the disciples because their faith is always in progress. So is mine. How about yours? They're trying to connect the dots. They're trying to figure it out as best they can. One of my favorite stories that happens in the days after Jesus died on the cross and then the tomb is found empty is the story we're learning from today. It's in John 21. I love this story because it involves food, and not just any food. I know. Are you as excited as me for a potluck brunch? I'm standing between you and brunch right now. I am fully aware. I want that food too. The story involves not just any food. It involves breakfast. Who here likes breakfast? Amen. Hallelujah. Joseph. Yes, brother from another mother. Yes, Lou. Breakfast is where it's at. And it's not just any breakfast. It's breakfast on the beach. It's fish cooked over a charcoal fire. Yes. Anyone do like the salmon on the grill? That's what Ashley's already requested for Mother's Day next Sunday. And so it's breakfast over a charcoal fire on the beach. It's in John 21. I've read this story before, but recently I noticed something in this story that I've never noticed before. And it's changed the way that I read it. I mean, this for me was an observation that happened within the past, 2 weeks. And I've known the story for a long time. And I'm going to share that with you today because it's actually pretty powerful. So here's how the story goes. I'm just going to read it for you today, okay? John 21. It says, after these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, which is the same thing as the Sea of Galilee. And he showed himself in this way. Gathered together were Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, we talked about him last week, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two others of his, so you have this whole group of disciples. Simon Peter said to them, to the disciples, I'm going fishing. They said to him, we'll go with you. They went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Bonus question, what do you think Simon Peter did for a living before Jesus called him to be a disciple? It's not a trick question, guys. this is a preacher's way of saying, are you still awake? Are you still awake? Yeah, he's a fisherman, right? So he's going back to what he knows. He knows how to be a fisherman and in the place where he grew up fishing, in the Sea of Galilee. Verse 4, just after daybreak, so they've been fishing all night long. This is how they did it back then. They would kind of get in a boat and they would go out there and they'd spend all night fishing. And the way they would fish was they'd have these nets, right? That they would kind of cast out into the water and draw them in and do that again and again. Verse 4, just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach. This is after the cross, after the resurrection. But the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, children, you have no fish, have you? And if I'm the disciples at this point, I'm kind of ticked. Like, seriously? Some dude has to stand there and just tease us for not catching fish. They answered him, no. This story is hilarious. You haven't caught any fish, have you? So it's like Jesus intentionally kind of making them mad. No, leave us alone. Verse 6, he said to them, cast the net to the right side of the boat. And imagine you're them. You've been casting the net on every side of the boat all night long. And so Jesus says, cast the net on the right side of the boat and you will find some. And John doesn't include the next verse. The next verse, he probably didn't include because we probably can't repeat it in church. But then one of the disciples is like, wait a minute, because it's deja vu, right? This story is amazing on so many levels. One being that God is reenacting the way Jesus first called some of the disciples. This is how it happened. Sea of Galilee, they're fishing, they're not catching anything. And then Jesus says, oh, try to fish over there. And then miraculously, all of a sudden they catch fish, and then they start following. It's a reenactment. And so for one of the disciples, it kicks in. That it was probably this deja vu feeling. Wait a minute. So back to the story. So they cast the net, and they were not able to haul it in because there were so many fish. And so, of course, now it all starts to come together. They can't recognize, they don't know who this person was that they thought was teasing them, making fun of them on the beach. But now, verse 7, that disciple whom Jesus loved, this is how John refers to himself, the disciple whom Jesus loved, said to Peter, it's the Lord. When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he had taken it off, and jumped into the sea. Verse 8, but the other disciple, imagine you're the other disciple. Like, seriously, John and Peter, you're gonna go swim to Jesus, and we have to, so the other disciples, they do what has to be done. They came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, only about 100 yards off. When they had gone ashore, they saw a charcoal fire there with fish on it and bread. Now, I know they didn't have grills or like big green eggs back then. I don't know why, but in my mind, I'm always picturing Jesus with, what do you call it, one of those kettles, like the black kettle charcoal grill, and he had his chimney starter. None of that existed in the first century, but that's how I read the Bible. Anyway, charcoal fire there with fish on it and bread. Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish that, isn't that interesting? There was already fish. Jesus is already cooking fish. He says, bring some of the fish that you've just caught. So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore, full of large fish, 153 of them. And though there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, come and have breakfast. Now, none of the disciples dared to ask him, who are you? Because they knew it was the Lord. And then verse 13, here's the last verse of the story. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them and did the same with the fish. Another amazing thing in this story. Remember I said God's reenacting? It's actually a reenactment on multiple levels. So let me see if you can catch what's happening. Jesus took the bread and gave it to them, took the fish, and what do you think this is reminding the disciples of if Jesus is doing this? A few weeks ago, we learned about the Last Supper. Yeah. Isn't it great, by the way, that so the last time they had a meal with Jesus where he served them, it was the Last Supper, and now it's the first breakfast. That's so cool. So I don't know if you agree or you're just laughing to humor me, or I don't know. I think it's cool. Last Supper, first breakfast. This was now the third time that Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. So like I said, there was something I saw in this story that I've never seen before, and it's changing the way that I read it. And it happened in verse 12. I'll read it to you again. Now none of the disciples dared to ask him, who are you? Because they knew it was the Lord. I've always just kind of skipped past that verse. But for some reason, I started thinking about that phrase. No one dared to ask him. Think about that with me. Imagine the scene. Like, hey, Scott, you ask him. Dick, you ask him. Jerry, you ask him. I don't want to ask him. Why? When do you do that? When do you, Kathy, you ask him. Ask him. No one dared to ask. When do we do that? When we're not sure. Yes? Why else would John put that in there? Because he could have just said the verse, they knew it was the Lord, but he didn't. He said, no one dared to ask him because did they? Did they really know it was the Lord? Or I wonder if they still weren't totally sure what was happening, what was going on. And as God is reenacting this, as they're interacting with Jesus on the beach and all of that, and their minds are just overwhelmed by everything that's happening, I think deep down in their hearts, they were still struggling to believe and to understand. They saw Jesus killed. People don't rise from the dead, and yet Jesus has. They're reacting to it the same way that I would have. I'll use the word impossible. They're there on the beach saying, this is impossible. No one dared to ask him, though, because they knew. Or did they? Or they wanted to know, or they were struggling to believe. I mean, this is just this whole new fascinating dimension to this story. And then I thought about it more, and I realized it's not just here. The way John tells these, so if you've been worshiping with us, where I've taken us since Easter, we've been walking through the book of John. So we have 4 accounts of the life of Jesus. We've been looking at John's since Easter Sunday here at Longleaf. And so the way John tells the Easter story is, remember on Easter, we looked at the first half of John chapter 20, when Mary went to the tomb expecting it to still be sealed up and to get permission and get help and roll the stone back so she could prepare Jesus' body. When she got there, though, the tomb was empty, and there was someone there. It was Jesus, but she didn't recognize him. She did. In fact, if you were here Easter, do you remember who she thought Jesus was? The gardener. She thought it was the gardener. She actually thought it was a grave robber, because the Bible says she actually asked, "Where have you taken the body? What have you done?" And it wasn't until this gardener spoke her name, Mary, that she realized this was Jesus. So we have this first moment of her struggling to believe and to understand what's God doing, what's happening. So she's drawn to the tomb. She meets Jesus. She's not totally sure. And then last week, when we were here, we looked at the second half of John chapter 20, when we talked about Thomas. And Thomas is hanging out with the disciples. This is right after the resurrection. And then Thomas has to step out of the room. Remember, someone had to meet the DoorDash driver. Uber Eats showed up. Thomas like, fine, I'll get it. So he leaves at the worst possible time when Jesus shows up to the rest of his friends. Thomas like, seriously? And so they tell Thomas, oh my gosh, you just missed it. It was Jesus. And what does Thomas say? Exactly what I would have. Unless I put my fingers in the holes from the nails, I will not believe. And then a week later, of course, so Mary, Thomas, struggling to believe, and now it happens again. No one dared to ask him, right? Just fascinating, this thread that runs through these stories. And yet what's happening through all of this is you keep having people drawn to Christ, Mary drawn to the tomb. She was the only one with courage to go. I mean, she could have been writing her own death warrant just by showing up, but she couldn't help herself. She was drawn to the presence of Christ. She had to go, drawn to the tomb. And then you have the disciples in this room, and Thomas comes back, and then a week later, Thomas, even though he missed out on this, is still drawn to this place to be with his friends, and then Jesus meets him there. Remember what we said last week? In the midst of his doubt, God meets Thomas with grace. And then you have this story where you have disciples out on a lake fishing. Jesus shows up on the beach and draws the disciples to himself. You could say it this way, that there's like this gravitational pull with Jesus, drawing people to himself. Or in light of this holiday, on this holy holiday on the calendar, I could say like a tractor beam. May the 4th be with you, everyone. Like this gravitational pull, drawing people to Jesus, to himself. But when they get there, not fully being able to understand and process what's happening. Drawn to Christ, drawn to the presence of Jesus, and even at that moment, realizing that they're just beginning to understand that their faith, it's not like they've figured everything out. They don't have certainty about everything. No one dared to ask him. Jesus draws them to the beach, and yet still deep in their hearts, there's like is this really happening? And remember the question they wanted to ask, but they didn't have the courage? The question they wanted to ask was, who are you? When we meet Jesus, there's this question, who are you? What's happening? It's this desire, this curiosity, this wonder to know more, drawing us deeper. So this past week, I was at this beautiful place called St. Simon's Island. And I know, but someone has to suffer for Jesus at St. Simon's Island, and that was me for I was there for a retreat for the Institute of Preaching. So good news, eventually the sermons might get a little better, so keep coming back. And so I was there. This is a cohort I've been a part of for a year, and this last week we were wrapping things up together. And so as I was driving up I-95 to go to the place is called Epworth by the Sea, is the name of the retreat center. Driving up the interstate, and I'm so stressed out. because I have this to-do list in my mind as I'm driving. As I'm driving, actually, the reminder app on my phone is like ding, ding, and the to-do list that's programmed into my phone is and then I'm aware of like all the emails that needed to be replied to that hadn't been replied to yet, and some of the text messages, and I'm just thinking of all this as I'm driving to a retreat to spend time with Jesus and get away. I'm just thinking of, I need to be at work, I need to be here, I can't be away until Thursday, and I'm driving up, and so I find myself finally, I'm like, well, I'll just pray, and so I pray, help, Lord, help me with all the stress and the things. And my favorite, I've told you this before, one of my favorite writers named Anne Lamott says that our prayers fall into 3 buckets. Thanks, wow, and help. You ever pray a help prayer before? That was me driving up there. So I get to the place, and we gather, and then we're given some free time. And I thought, oh, great, I can go open up Outlook and just start looking at emails. And then something kind of caught me. I mean, it was the Holy Spirit, of course. I didn't realize that. But as I'm walking, I see a dock. It's a pier that went out to this river. And it just looks so peaceful. And I thought, Andy, let me treat myself. Treat yourself, Kevin. Before I do the email, let me just go sit by the river for like a couple of minutes. So I go sit on this dock on this bench. And my phone, which I keep in like my back pocket like this, right? So apparently while I was sitting there, Ashley, is that a word from the Lord or from Siri? Oh, okay, all right. So as I'm sitting there on the dock, my phone kind of like pops out of the back pocket. Ever done that number to you before or whatever? I didn't realize though. And so I like sit there, oh, this is great. So I get up and I walk away. And I left my phone. I lost my phone out on this pier. Don't you hate it when God answers your prayers? So I didn't realize right away. So by the time I went back to the pier, it was gone. I thought it had fallen in the river. And my phone's just gone. Right. I know, Sharon. Like facial tick. I'm twitching. I'm like, no! Like the phone separation anxiety. Like, and so I wish I could tell you at that moment, I realized what God was doing to me. And just been like, just chill. Kevin, today is a day to spend time with Jesus. It's just to let God love you. But I didn't. I got frustrated and mad. And I started thinking, okay, if I drive to the UPS store, I could like maybe rent a computer and like check in and like check. I started going through all this, and I got more and more frustrated. And then finally there was this dawning of realization that, you know what, maybe today I did need to just kind of stop. There was a beach, so I thought, let me just drive to a beach. And so I started walking on a beach, and out of muscle memory, I tried to start a podcast, because when I walk, I'll listen to like an audiobook or a podcast, and I didn't even have the AirPods, I didn't have the phone, and I found myself, this is how much of a problem I have. I found myself walking, and I'm like, Siri, start the podcast or whatever, and it's not, because it was muscle memory, until I'm walking down the beach, and I'm embarrassed to admit this, I'm your pastor, but I was like, fine, Lord, I guess I'll pray, because I can't do anything else. I know, it's embarrassing. I prayed out of like last resort, out of desperation. And then finally, I realized there on the beach that what God had been up to all along. I mean, I've told you before, he loves a great surprise party. He has a great sense of humor. As I realized on the beach, no, Jesus just wanted to spend some time with me. In John 21, Jesus just wanted to spend some time with his disciples. So what did he do? He drew them to himself. You know, Jesus is actually drawing you to himself today. He does it all the time. Constantly. It's like this gravity of grace, this gravity of God's love, always drawing us toward everything that Jesus has for us, drawing us toward love, toward peace, toward freedom, drawing us to a place where God can renew our hope and our strength, drawing us to a place. What do you need from God this week? What do you need from Jesus today? Drawing us into the light of his love, away from, and here's the other part of it too. Here's the other part of the sermon. Don't worry, everything I just did, I'm not about to double that. We're almost at the end, I promise. God had to draw me away from my inbox so that he could draw me out to the beach. So, today, what is Christ drawing you away from? Is there a distraction? Is there a guilt? Is it something connected to something in the past? Is there a relationship that's gone sideways, and so in your heart there's a place of tension or conflict, or what's God drawing you away from today so that Jesus can draw you to himself, into the light of his love, his peace,